For 15 years, Rachel Torres had been just another face in the garage at Summit Auto Repair, fixing engines that others couldn't diagnose, solving problems that stumped veteran mechanics, and quietly going home each night without anyone knowing. She carried a silver star and combat action badge in her toolbox. When a convoy of Green Berets rolled into her shop with damaged tactical vehicles that 3 other garages had failed to repair, they saw just another grease-covered mechanic in coveralls. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most decorated combat engineers to ever serve in Syria. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rachel Torres arrived at Summit Auto Repair at 6:30 am sharp, just like she had every weekday morning for the past 15 years. At 42 years old, with her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her compact frame disappearing beneath oil-stained coveralls, she moved through the Denver garage like a shadow. The early morning light filtering through the grimy windows cast long shadows across the concrete floor, and Rachel preferred it that way. Shadows were familiar territory. Morning. "Torres," grunted Steve Kowalski, the lead mechanic, as he grabbed his coffee from the break room. "We've got that Chevy Silverado with the mystery knock coming in first thing. Jimmy couldn't figure it out yesterday." Rachel nodded silently, already mentally running through the diagnostic possibilities. Engine knock could be anything from carbon buildup to timing issues, but there were subtle variations in the sound that most mechanics missed. After 15 years of listening to engines fail under the worst possible conditions, Rachel had developed an ear that could diagnose problems others couldn't even hear. Greg Nakamura, the shop owner, emerged from his office with the day's work orders. A second-generation Japanese-American who had built Summit Auto from a 2-bay operation into Denver's most trusted independent garage. Greg had always appreciated Rachel's quiet competence. "Torres, I'm putting you on the Silverado and that Ford F250 with the transmission issues. Amby and Tom can handle the routine maintenance." Rachel accepted the assignments without comment. After all these years, she had earned the right to tackle the challenging cases, though she suspected her co-workers still saw her as the quiet woman who happened to be good with engines. The truth was more complicated. Rachel Torres was probably the most skilled diagnostic mechanic in Colorado, with an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that bordered on supernatural. She could listen to an engine for 30 seconds and identify problems that would take other mechanics hours to find. She could feel vibrations through her hands that revealed bearing wear, timing issues, or impending failures long before warning. Lights appeared. But what her co-workers didn't know was that this expertise hadn't come from vocational school or years of routine maintenance. As Rachel settled into her work bay and began preparing her tools, she caught fragments of conversation from the other mechanics. "Did you see the game last night?" Tom Bradley was saying to Andy Chun. "That fourth-quarter comeback was incredible." The casual chatter of men who had never experienced life-or-death situations where mechanical failure meant more than missed appointments or towing bills. Rachel had learned to appreciate the normalcy of civilian conversation, even if she couldn't fully participate in it. Maria Gonzalez, the shop's only other female employee who handled parts ordering and customer service, waved from the front desk. "Rachel, that customer with the Subaru called again. He specifically requested you look at it when it comes in this afternoon." Rachel wasn't surprised. Word had spread quietly through Denver's automotive community that if you had a problem nobody else could solve, you brought it to the quiet woman at Summit Auto. She didn't advertise her skills or boast about her success rate, but satisfied. Customers talked. The morning routine was familiar and comforting. Check the work orders, review the previous day's diagnostic notes, organize tools according to the day's expected challenges. Rachel had developed systems and procedures that maximized efficiency while maintaining meticulous attention to detail. Other mechanics sometimes joked about her methodical approach, but they couldn't argue with her results. When Rachel Torres worked on a vehicle, it stayed fixed. What none of them knew was that Rachel's systematic approach to automotive repair had been forged in very different circumstances. Every procedure she followed, every diagnostic technique she employed, every safety protocol she maintained had roots in experiences that civilian mechanics couldn't imagine. The ability to work quickly and precisely under pressure, to diagnose complex mechanical problems with limited information, to maintain focus when lives depended on getting it right. These weren't skills learned in community college automotive programs. As the morning progressed, Rachel lost herself in the familiar rhythm of diagnostic work. The Silverado's engine knock revealed itself as a classic case of carbon buildup, combined with incorrect timing, fixable with a thorough cleaning and timing adjustment. The Ford's transmission problems were more complex, requiring careful analysis of fluid pressure and solenoid function. These were the challenges Rachel enjoyed, complex problems that required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems behaved under stress. Around 10 a.m., the shop's relative quiet was interrupted by the sound of heavy vehicles approaching. Rachel looked up from the Ford's transmission to see a convoy of military vehicles turning into Summit Auto's parking lot. 3 tactical trucks with government plates, their desert tan paint jobs and reinforced construction clearly identifying them as military hardware. Behind them came a standard military Humvee and what appeared to be a mobile command vehicle. "What the hell?" Steve muttered, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "We don't usually get military contracts." Greg emerged from his office, equally puzzled by the unexpected arrival. Government vehicles occasionally came to Summit Auto for routine maintenance, but never in convoy formation, and never with the sense of urgency that seemed to radiate from the approaching vehicles. The lead tactical truck pulled directly into the main service bay, followed by the others positioning themselves around the shop's exterior. Rachel noticed immediately that these weren't standard military transport vehicles. The reinforced armor plating, the specialized suspension systems, the heavy-duty modifications, these were tactical vehicles designed for combat operations. Vehicles built to operate in environments where mechanical failure could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic loss of life. 3 men in military fatigues climbed out of the lead vehicle, and Rachel felt a familiar tingle of recognition. She had learned to identify military personnel by their bearing, their movement patterns, their unconscious habits of situational awareness. These weren't regular Army mechanics or transport drivers. The way they scanned the environment, positioned themselves for mutual support, and maintained alert readiness even in a civilian garage. These were special operations personnel. The man who appeared to be their leader approached Greg with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command authority. Rachel couldn't hear the initial conversation from her position at the Ford's transmission, but she could see Greg's expression change from confusion to concern to professional focus. Whatever problem had brought these military vehicles to Summit Auto, it was serious enough to require immediate attention. Rachel continued working on the transmission, but part of her attention remained focused on the developing situation. After 15 years of civilian life, military vehicles and personnel still triggered responses she had learned to control, but never fully eliminated. The sight of tactical trucks brought back memories of convoy operations, of mechanical problems that had to be solved under enemy fire, of situations where her diagnostic skills had meant the difference between successful missions and disaster. As she completed her analysis of the Ford's transmission problem, Rachel became aware that the conversation between the military personnel and Greg had grown more intense. She could see gestures toward the tactical vehicles, heads shaking in apparent frustration, and the kind of body language that suggested a serious problem without obvious solutions. Greg approached her workstation with an expression that mixed opportunity with concern. "Rachel," he said quietly, "we may have a situation that requires your particular expertise. These gentlemen have some specialized vehicles that need immediate attention, and apparently 3 other shops have already failed to solve their problems." Rachel looked toward the military vehicles with the calm assessment that had become second nature over decades of professional challenges. Whatever problems these tactical trucks were experiencing, they would require the kind of diagnostic expertise that went beyond routine automotive repair. The kind of expertise that could only come from someone who understood how military vehicles were supposed to perform under the most demanding conditions imaginable. But as far as the Green Berets who had brought their vehicles to Summit Auto knew, Rachel Torres was just another civilian mechanic who happened to be available on a Tuesday morning in Denver. They had no idea they were about to encounter someone whose understanding of tactical vehicle maintenance had been earned through 3 tours of combat operations in Syria, where mechanical expertise wasn't just a profession, it was a survival skill that had kept her unit alive in situations that should have been impossible to survive. The legend of Rachel Torres had grown quietly over the years, passed from customer to customer like an underground secret. "Take it to Summit Auto," they would whisper. "Ask for the woman who works in the back. She can fix anything." But legends, Rachel had learned, were dangerous things. They drew attention, and attention was something she had spent 15 years carefully avoiding. Marcus Webb had been one of the first to spread the word. A local contractor whose fleet of work trucks kept Summit Auto busy, Marcus had brought Rachel a 2008 Ford F350 that 3 other shops had declared dead. The truck's diesel engine had developed a mysterious power loss that defied conventional diagnosis. Computer diagnostics showed normal parameters. Compression tests were within specification. Fuel system pressure checked out perfectly. Yet the truck could barely maintain highway speeds and produced clouds of white smoke under load. "This engine's got maybe a week left in it," the previous mechanic had told Marcus. "You're looking at a complete rebuild, probably 15 grand. Marcus had been preparing to write off the truck when his brother-in-law mentioned Summit Auto. "There's this woman there," he had said. "Real quiet, keeps to herself. But she's got some kind of magic touch with engines that won't cooperate." Rachel had listened to the F350's engine for exactly 47 seconds before asking Marcus to pop the hood. She spent another 3 minutes running her hands along fuel lines, checking connections that looked perfect to untrained eyes, and listening to subtle variations in engine rhythm that other mechanics missed entirely. Hairline crack in the high pressure fuel rail, she had told Marcus. "Microscopic, but it's creating pressure fluctuations that the computer can't detect. Replace the rail and she run like new." The repair had cost Marcus $400 instead of $15,000, and the truck was still running strong 7 years later. Word spread through Denver's contractor community, then to the car enthusiast networks, then to anyone who owned a vehicle that had stumped the experts. Rachel Torres became the mechanic of last resort, the person you called when conventional wisdom had failed. What these satisfied customers didn't know was that Rachel's diagnostic abilities came from experiences that had nothing to do with civilian automotive repair. During her second deployment to Syria, Rachel's combat engineer unit had been responsible for maintaining a fleet of tactical vehicles that operated under conditions that would destroy civilian equipment within days. Desert heat that reached 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Sand that infiltrated every moving part. Improvised explosive devices that damaged vehicles in ways no manufacturer had anticipated. In that environment, mechanical failure didn't mean calling a tow truck. It meant being stranded in hostile territory with enemy forces approaching. Rachel had learned to diagnose problems through sound, vibration, and intuition because there was no time for systematic troubleshooting when lives hung in the balance. She had developed the ability to feel engine problems through her hands, to hear the subtle changes in rhythm that indicated impending failure, to understand how mechanical systems behaved under extreme stress, the skills that made Rachel legendary. Among Denver's automotive community were the same skills that had kept her unit alive during 3 combat deployments. The ability to work quickly under pressure, to find solutions when conventional approaches failed, to maintain focus when the stakes were life and death. These weren't talents learned in vocational school. They were survival skills forged in the crucible of combat engineering operations, where mechanical expertise meant the difference between successful missions and catastrophic loss of life. But Rachel had never shared these details with her civilian coworkers or customers. As far as they knew, she was just naturally gifted with engines. A quiet woman who had always worked at Summit Auto, who kept to herself, who somehow possessed an almost supernatural understanding of mechanical systems. The truth was more complicated and far more dangerous to discuss. Steve Kowalski had been working alongside Rachel for 8 years, and he still couldn't figure her out. "It's like she can see inside engines," he had told his wife after another day of watching Rachel solve problems that left him baffled. "I've been turning wrenches for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Yesterday, she diagnosed a timing chain issue on a Volkswagen just by listening to it idle. Didn't even open the hood. What Steve didn't understand was that Rachel's diagnostic process included elements that civilian mechanics never encountered. When she listened to an engine, she wasn't just hearing mechanical sounds. She was applying pattern recognition skills, developed through years of maintaining vehicles that operated at the edge of mechanical tolerance. When she felt vibrations through her hands, she was using sensitivity trained through experiences where detecting subtle changes in equipment performance could prevent disasters. The other mechanics at Summit Auto had developed their own theories about Rachel's background. Tom Bradley was convinced she had grown up in a family of mechanics and had been working on engines since childhood. Andy Chun thought she might have engineering training that she kept quiet about. Maria Gonzalez suspected Rachel had worked for one of the major automotive manufacturers before coming to Summit Auto, gaining experience with advanced diagnostic techniques that weren't widely known. None of them guessed the truth, that Rachel Torres was a decorated combat veteran whose mechanical expertise had been earned in the deserts of Syria, where her ability to maintain tactical vehicles under enemy fire had saved countless lives and completed missions that should have been impossible. The silver star in her toolbox wasn't for automotive excellence. It was for extraordinary heroism under combat conditions that civilian mechanics couldn't imagine. Greg Nakamura had stopped questioning Rachel's methods years ago. Her success rate was unprecedented, customer satisfaction was perfect, and her diagnostic accuracy had never been wrong. When other shops sent their impossible cases to Summit Auto, Greg automatically assigned them to Rachel. "She's worth 3 normal mechanics," he had told his accountant during their annual business review. "I don't know where she learned what she knows, but I'm not asking questions as long as she keeps performing miracles." The closest anyone had come to discovering Rachel's background was during a conversation with a customer whose military bearing had caught her attention. Retired Army Colonel James Patterson had brought his personal vehicle to Summit Auto after other shops had failed to solve a complex electrical problem. While Rachel worked on his car, Patterson had watched her systematic approach to troubleshooting with growing recognition. "You move like military," Patterson had observed quietly. "The way you organize your tools, the methodical approach to problem solving. Were you ever in service?" Rachel had paused in her work, meeting the colonel's eyes directly for the first time. "Sometimes people develop systematic approaches through different kinds of experience," she had replied carefully. "What matters is getting the job done right." Patterson had nodded, understanding that some questions shouldn't be pressed. But Rachel could see the recognition in his expression. That had been 3 years ago, and Patterson had become one of Rachel's most loyal customers. He brought all his vehicles to Summit Auto and specifically requested Rachel's services. understanding that he was dealing with someone whose expertise went far beyond civilian automotive repair. But he had respected her privacy, never pushing for details about her background or experience. As Rachel completed the Ford transmission diagnosis and prepared to tackle the next challenge, she reflected on how carefully she had constructed her civilian life. 15 years of quiet competence, of solving problems without drawing attention to herself, of building a reputation for excellence while maintaining the anonymity that had become essential to her peace of mind. The war was over, the missions were classified, and the unit that had earned her decorations no longer officially existed, but the skills remained. The ability to diagnose complex mechanical problems under pressure, to find solutions when conventional approaches failed, to maintain focus when the stakes were high. These were permanent parts of who Rachel Torres had become. They made her legendary among Denver's automotive community, even though no one understood the true source of her expertise. Now, as military vehicles sat in Summit Auto's service bays and Green Berets waited for solutions that 3 other shops had failed to provide, Rachel's carefully maintained civilian existence was about to collide with her classified military past. The quiet mechanic who had spent 15 years avoiding attention was about to discover that some skills were too valuable to remain hidden forever. Sergeant Major David Kim stepped out of the lead tactical vehicle with the measured confidence of a man who had spent 22 years in special operations. At 44 years old, with graying temples and the kind of alertness that never fully switched off, Kim carried himself like someone accustomed to making life or death decisions under pressure. Behind him emerged Staff Sergeant Brandon Lewis and Sergeant Tyler Jackson, both younger but bearing the same unmistakable signs of elite military training. "Mr. Nakamura?" Kim approached Greg with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. "I'm Sergeant Major Kim, 5th Special Forces Group. We have a situation that requires immediate attention from your best mechanic." Greg nodded, trying to process why Green Berets would bring their vehicles to a civilian garage in Denver. "What kind of situation are we talking about, Sergeant Major?" Kim gestured toward the tactical vehicles now occupying Summit Auto's service bays. 3 of our tactical support vehicles have developed identical engine problems during training exercises at Fort Carson. Problems that have stumped our motor pool mechanics and 3 civilian shops in Colorado Springs. We're scheduled to deploy in 72 hours, and these vehicles are mission-critical equipment. The urgency in Kim's voice was unmistakable. Rachel, still working on the Ford transmission, but listening carefully to the conversation, recognized the controlled tension that came with looming deadlines and high-stakes operations. She had heard that same tone countless times during her military service, usually preceding missions where equipment failure wasn't an option. "What exactly is wrong with them?" Greg asked, walking toward the nearest tactical truck. The vehicle was impressive, a heavily modified 550 chassis with armor plating, specialized communications equipment, and mechanical modifications that clearly indicated military engineering. But even from a distance, Rachel could hear the irregular idle pattern that suggested serious engine problems. "Staff." Sergeant Lewis stepped forward to provide the technical briefing. "Intermittent power loss under load, irregular fuel pressure readings, and engine timing that drifts outside acceptable parameters. Computer diagnostics show normal operation, but performance is degraded by approximately 30%. All 3 vehicles developed identical symptoms within a 6-hour period during mountain training exercises." Rachel's hands paused in their work on the Ford transmission. Identical failures across multiple vehicles suggested either contaminated fuel, environmental factors, or a design flaw that had been triggered by specific operating conditions. The mountain training detail was particularly significant. High-altitude operations created stresses on engine systems that could reveal problems invisible under normal conditions. "Have you tried different mechanics?" Greg asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Kim's expression confirmed his assumption. Fort Carson's motor pool worked on them for 18 hours. 2 shops in Colorado Springs spent a combined 43 hours trying to diagnose the problem. A dealership in Pueblo declared them unfixable. Without complete engine rebuilds, we're running out of time and options. The frustration in Kim's voice was carefully controlled but clearly present. Rachel understood that for special operations personnel, equipment failure wasn't just inconvenient. It could compromise missions and endanger lives. These vehicles weren't just transportation. They were specialized platforms designed to support operations where conventional equipment would fail. Sergeant Jackson, who appeared to be the team's technical specialist, added more context. These trucks are configured for high-altitude operations with specialized engine modifications. The problem started during cold weather training above 8,000 feet elevation. Normal operating parameters don't seem to apply in those conditions. Rachel felt her diagnostic instincts engaging despite her effort to remain focused on civilian repair work. High-altitude cold weather operations created unique stresses on engine systems that few civilian mechanics ever encountered. Fuel mixture problems, ignition timing issues, and intake system modifications required for altitude compensation. These were technical challenges that went far beyond routine automotive repair. Greg looked toward Rachel's workstation, then back at the Green Berets. I have a mechanic who specializes in complex diagnostic problems. She's the best in Denver at solving cases that stump other shops. But I should warn you, these are military vehicles with specialized systems. She might not have experience with tactical modifications. Kim followed Greg's gaze toward Rachel, who was methodically reassembling the Ford transmission with the kind of precision that suggested extensive mechanical training. At this point, we're willing to try anyone who might have fresh insights. Our deployment timeline is non-negotiable, and replacing these vehicles isn't an option. As the group approached Rachel's workstation, she became acutely aware of the Green Berets' presence. Military personnel carried themselves differently than civilian customers, more alert, more systematic in their observations, more accustomed to evaluating people in situations for potential threats or opportunities. After 15 years of civilian life, being around soldiers again triggered responses Rachel had learned to control but never fully eliminated. Torres, Greg called out. These gentlemen need help with some specialized vehicles. Think you can take a look? Rachel straightened up from the Ford transmission, wiping her hands on a shop rag before turning to face the Green Berets. For a moment, she felt the familiar sensation of being evaluated by professional soldiers, the quick assessment of posture, competence, and potential threat level that special operations personnel conducted automatically. "Ma'am," Kim said, with professional courtesy, "we have 3 tactical vehicles with engine problems that have defeated some very experienced mechanics. We're hoping you might have some insights that others have missed." Rachel nodded, noting the careful respect in Kim's address. Special Forces personnel were trained to work with local assets and understood the value of treating civilian experts with appropriate deference. "What's the operational timeline?" Rachel asked, the question emerging before she consciously decided to speak. Kim's eyebrows raised slightly at her use of military terminology, but he answered directly. 72 hours until deployment. These vehicles need to be mission-ready within 60 hours to allow for final systems checks. Rachel walked toward the nearest tactical truck, her trained eyes already noting details that civilian mechanics might miss. The vehicle's modifications were extensive and sophisticated: reinforced engine mounts, upgraded cooling systems, specialized exhaust configurations, and electronic modifications that indicated communication and navigation equipment far beyond civilian standards. This wasn't just a modified civilian truck. It was a purpose-built tactical platform designed for special operations. High-altitude training, she said, more statement than question. Mountain operations above 8,000 feet in cold weather conditions. Kim exchanged glances with his team members. The civilian mechanic was demonstrating familiarity with operational parameters that most civilian contractors wouldn't understand or consider relevant. That's correct, Lewis confirmed. Problems developed during sustained operations between 8,200 and 9,400 feet elevation. Ambient temperatures between 15 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Rachel nodded, already formulating diagnostic possibilities based on the environmental factors. High-altitude cold weather operations created specific challenges for engine systems that required both technical knowledge and practical experience to address effectively. Mind if I listen to the engines? Rachel asked, approaching the lead vehicle with the kind of systematic caution that Kim recognized as professional competence. Of course, he replied, genuinely curious about what this civilian mechanic might identify that military specialists had missed. Rachel positioned herself near the truck's engine compartment and gestured for Kim to start the vehicle. The engine turned over immediately, settling into an idle that sounded normal to untrained ears. But Rachel's expression changed within seconds as she detected the subtle irregularities that indicated serious problems beneath the surface. After 2 minutes of careful listening, Rachel moved to different positions around the vehicle, using her hands to feel vibrations through the chassis and her ears to isolate specific mechanical sounds. Her systematic approach and obvious expertise caught the attention of all three Green Berets, who recognized professional diagnostic technique when they saw it. "Shut it down," Rachel said finally. Kim complied immediately, noting that the civilian mechanic's demeanor had shifted from polite inquiry to focused professional assessment. "Well?" he asked, hoping for insights that previous mechanics had failed to provide. Rachel was quiet for a moment, processing what she had observed and comparing it to similar problems she had encountered under very different circumstances. "I have some ideas," she said carefully, "but I'll need to examine all three vehicles and review their maintenance records to be certain. These modifications create interactions between systems that aren't covered in standard diagnostic procedures." The Green Berets exchanged meaningful looks. This civilian mechanic was speaking their language, demonstrating understanding of military vehicle complexity that suggested experience far beyond typical automotive repair. But they still saw her as just another contractor, albeit one who seemed more competent than the others they had encountered. What they didn't know was that Rachel Torres had spent 3 combat deployments maintaining vehicles identical to these under conditions that made their current timeline pressures seem manageable. The problems they were describing, the environmental factors they had mentioned, the specialized modifications they were dealing with, these weren't new challenges for Rachel. They were familiar territory from a professional life she had spent 15 years trying to forget. Rachel spent the next hour conducting the most thorough diagnostic assessment the Green Berets had ever witnessed. While previous mechanics had relied heavily on computer diagnostics and standard troubleshooting procedures, Rachel's approach was fundamentally different. She treated each vehicle like a complex system, where every component influenced every other component, and where environmental factors could trigger cascading failures that defied conventional analysis. "Ma'am," Sergeant Jackson observed after watching Rachel systematically examine the 3rd tactical truck, "you're checking things that our motor pool mechanics never even considered. That intake temperature sensor modification, the altitude compensation programming, most civilian mechanics wouldn't even know those systems exist." Rachel paused in her examination of the engine bay, realizing that her diagnostic process was revealing more knowledge than a typical civilian mechanic should possess. "Complex vehicles require systematic approaches," she replied carefully. "When standard diagnostic procedures fail, you have to consider interactions between modified systems that weren't designed to work together." What Rachel didn't mention was that her systematic approach had been developed during 3 combat deployments, where tactical vehicle failures could mean the difference between successful missions and catastrophic loss of life. She had learned to diagnose problems by considering operational stresses that civilian mechanics never encountered, environmental factors that pushed equipment beyond design specifications, and mechanical interactions that only became apparent under extreme conditions. Sergeant Major Kim watched Rachel work with growing interest. Her diagnostic technique demonstrated familiarity with military vehicle modifications that suggested experience far beyond typical civilian automotive repair. The way she examined specialized components, her understanding of tactical communication systems, her knowledge of high-altitude engine modifications, these indicated exposure to military engineering that was difficult to explain. The fuel system modifications are interesting, Rachel commented as she examined the specialized fuel injection components. These trucks have been configured for operation with multiple fuel types under extreme conditions. That creates complications. When altitude and temperature variations affect fuel density and combustion characteristics. Staff Sergeant Lewis exchanged glances with Jackson. The civilian mechanic was describing technical challenges that most civilian contractors wouldn't understand or consider relevant. Military vehicles were designed to operate on whatever fuel was available in theater, from high-grade aviation fuel to contaminated diesel captured from enemy supplies. The ability to adapt to different fuel characteristics was a tactical advantage that came with significant mechanical complexity. Have you worked on military vehicles before? Kim asked, directly, genuinely curious about Rachel's background. The question hung in the air for several moments while Rachel considered how to respond without revealing information she had spent 15 years keeping private. I've encountered similar modifications on civilian vehicles used in extreme environments, she replied, which was technically true but deliberately incomplete. Mining operations, Arctic research, high-altitude construction projects, they all require adaptations that create similar diagnostic challenges. Rachel's explanation was plausible, but Kim noticed that she hadn't directly answered his question. Special operations personnel were trained to detect evasion and misdirection, and Rachel's response demonstrated the kind of careful word choice that suggested she was concealing something significant. But for now, Kim was more interested in results than background investigations. After completing her initial assessment of all 3 vehicles, Rachel requested access to maintenance records and operational logs from the training exercises where the problems had developed. I need to understand the exact sequence of events that triggered these failures, she explained. Simultaneous problems across multiple vehicles usually indicate environmental factors or operational stresses that exceeded design parameters. The maintenance records revealed details that confirmed Rachel's initial suspicions. All 3 vehicles had experienced identical failures during a specific phase of high-altitude training that involved sustained operation at maximum load capacity and sub-freezing temperatures. The combination of altitude, temperature, and operational stress had triggered cascading failures in systems that worked perfectly under normal conditions. Here's what happened, Rachel explained, spreading the maintenance logs across a workbench. Your vehicles are configured with altitude compensation systems that automatically adjust fuel mixture and ignition timing based on atmospheric pressure. But during your mountain training, ambient temperatures dropped below the threshold where these compensation systems function properly. Kim leaned forward, interested in Rachel's analysis. Explain that in practical terms. The altitude compensation systems assume that atmospheric density changes are primarily due to elevation, not temperature, Rachel continued. When you combine high altitude with extreme cold, the actual air density becomes significantly different from what the compensation algorithms expect. The result is fuel mixture problems that cascade into ignition timing issues and eventually cause the power loss you're experiencing. Sergeant Jackson was taking detailed notes. Why didn't our motor pool mechanics identify this? They have extensive training on these vehicle modifications. Rachel's answer revealed more expertise than she intended. Because this specific failure mode only occurs under operational conditions that most mechanics never encounter. You have to understand how tactical vehicles behave under sustained combat stress to recognize the symptoms. She paused, realizing that her explanation had implied personal experience with combat operations. The three Green Berets were now paying close attention to Rachel's every word. Her technical analysis was far beyond what they had expected from a civilian mechanic, and her casual references to combat operational requirements suggested background knowledge that was difficult to explain through civilian experience alone. The solution requires recalibrating the altitude compensation systems to account for extreme temperature variations. Rachel continued, focusing on technical details rather than the implications of her knowledge. It's not a standard procedure because most mechanics never encounter vehicles that operate under these specific conditions. Kim was beginning to suspect that Summit Auto's diagnostic specialist might have military experience that she wasn't discussing. Her technical knowledge, her systematic approach to complex problems, her understanding of tactical vehicle requirements, these suggested training and experience that went far beyond civilian automotive repair. How long would this recalibration take? Lewis asked, still focused on their deployment timeline. 6 hours per vehicle if everything goes smoothly, Rachel replied. 12 hours if we encounter complications with the specialized programming. But I should warn you, this modification will require adjustments that aren't covered by standard maintenance procedures. You'll need authorization for changes to factory-specified configurations. Kim made a decision that would change everything. Ma'am, I'm authorized to approve any modifications necessary to make these vehicles mission-ready. What do you need to get started? Rachel felt a familiar surge of professional satisfaction. After 15 years of civilian automotive repair, she was facing a challenge that required the full extent of her technical expertise. The problem-solving skills she had developed during combat deployments, the understanding of tactical vehicle requirements she had gained through 3 tours of duty, the diagnostic abilities she had honed under life-or-death pressure, all of these would be necessary to solve the Green Berets problem within their timeline. But accepting this assignment meant revealing capabilities that would raise questions about her background. Military-specific technical knowledge, familiarity with tactical modifications, understanding of combat operational requirements, these weren't skills that civilian mechanics typically possessed. I'll need access to specialized diagnostic equipment and programming tools, Rachel said, making her decision. And I'll need to work without interruption for the next 8 hours. This kind of system modification requires complete focus. As Rachel began gathering the tools and equipment necessary for the most complex repair work she had undertaken in 15 years, she felt the familiar sensation of professional challenge that had defined her military career. The quiet civilian life she had built at Summit Auto was about to collide with skills and experience that belonged to a classified world she had left behind. The Green Berets still saw her as just another civilian contractor, albeit one with unusual expertise. They had no idea that they were working with a decorated combat engineer whose understanding of tactical vehicle maintenance had been earned under enemy fire in the deserts of Syria. But that was about to change. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rachel was deep into the diagnostic programming on the second tactical vehicle when the moment that would change everything occurred. She had been working steadily for 3 hours, her hands moving with practiced efficiency across specialized diagnostic equipment that most civilian mechanics had never seen. The complex recalibration process required accessing military-specific programming interfaces that were protected by security protocols designed to prevent unauthorized modifications. The altitude compensation subroutine is locked behind a security firewall, Rachel muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. I need to access the tactical modification protocols to override the factory limitations. She reached into her toolbox for a specialized programming device, one that she had carried for 15 years but rarely used in civilian repair work. Sergeant Major Kim, who had been observing Rachel's work from a respectful distance, moved closer when he saw the device she was using. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "that's a military specification programming interface. Those aren't available to civilian contractors." His voice carried a note of suspicion that hadn't been present earlier. Rachel froze, realizing that her focus on solving the technical problem had caused her to reveal equipment that civilian mechanics shouldn't possess. The programming device. In her hands was standard issue for combat engineers who worked on tactical vehicles in the field, but it was classified technology that required specific security clearances to obtain. "I acquired this through surplus channels," Rachel replied, but even as she spoke, she knew the explanation wouldn't satisfy Kim's growing suspicions. Military programming interfaces were items that appeared in surplus sales and special operations. Personnel were trained to recognize security inconsistencies. Staff Sergeant Lewis stepped forward, his attention focused on Rachel's toolbox, which was now open and revealing equipment that no civilian garage should contain. "Ma'am, that's not surplus equipment. Those diagnostic tools are current issue gear for special operations vehicle maintenance. I used identical equipment during my last deployment." The atmosphere in the garage suddenly shifted. The professional courtesy that had characterized the interaction between Rachel and the Green Berets was replaced by alert suspicion as the soldiers began to question everything they thought they knew about Summit Auto's diagnostic specialist. "I think we need to have a conversation," Kim said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting direct answers to important questions. "About your background and how you acquired military-specific equipment that's not available to civilian contractors." Rachel felt the walls of her carefully constructed civilian identity beginning to crumble. For 15 years, she had maintained perfect operational security, never revealing details about her military service or the classified missions that had earned her decorations. But her professional instincts had overridden her security protocols, and now she was facing questions that could expose everything she had worked to keep hidden. "Sergeant Major," she said carefully, "my background is complicated. Some aspects of my experience aren't appropriate for discussion in civilian settings." It was a deflection that any military professional would recognize, the careful language used when classified information couldn't be shared. Kim's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I'm responsible for the security of these vehicles and the success of our upcoming mission. If you have access to classified equipment or information, I need to understand how and why." The confrontation was interrupted by Sergeant Jackson, who had been examining Rachel's toolbox more carefully. "Sergeant Major," he called out, "you need to see this." His voice carried a note of surprise that caught everyone's attention. Jackson was holding a small metal container that had been nestled among Rachel's diagnostic tools. The container was military issue, designed to protect sensitive items during field operations. "Ma'am," Jackson said to Rachel, "this is a military metal case. Mind explaining why you're carrying military decorations in your civilian toolbox?" Rachel's heart sank as she realized that Jackson had discovered the one item she had never been able to bring herself to leave at home. The metal case contained her Silver Star and Combat Action Badge, awards that represented the most significant achievements and sacrifices of her military career. She had carried them through 15 years of civilian life, unable to display them, but unwilling to abandon them entirely. "I think," Kim said quietly, "that we're dealing with more than just an unusually skilled civilian mechanic." His tone had shifted from suspicion to professional recognition as he began to piece together the implications of what his team had discovered. Rachel looked at the 3 Green Berets, all of whom were now regarding her with intense curiosity rather than casual respect. She had spent 15 years successfully maintaining her civilian cover, but a moment of professional instinct had exposed equipment and credentials that raised questions she couldn't answer without revealing her true background. "Open the case," Kim ordered, though his voice carried more curiosity than hostility. It was the tone of a professional soldier who suspected he was dealing with a fellow veteran rather than a potential security threat. Rachel hesitated for a long moment, knowing that opening the metal case would end her civilian anonymity forever. But she also understood that her current situation had moved beyond the point where deflection and evasion would be sufficient. The Green Berets had discovered evidence that demanded explanation, and any attempt to continue concealing her background would only increase their suspicions. With deliberate care, Rachel opened the metal case and set it on the workbench where all 3 soldiers could see its contents. The silver star gleamed under the garage's fluorescent lights, its distinctive design immediately recognizable to any military professional. Beside it lay the Combat Action Badge, indicating direct engagement with enemy forces under combat conditions. The silence that followed was profound. All 3 Green Berets stared at the decorations, understanding immediately that they were looking at awards that represented extraordinary service under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The Silver Star was awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States, the kind of heroism that was rare even among special operations personnel. "Jesus Christ," Lewis whispered, his voice filled with genuine awe. "Ma'am, the Silver Star." "That's—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. Kim leaned closer to examine the awards, noting details that confirmed their authenticity. "These aren't replicas," he said quietly. "This is the real thing. Ma'am, I need to ask you directly, are you a combat veteran?" Rachel met Kim's gaze directly for the first time since the conversation had begun. After 15 years of carefully maintained civilian identity, she was about to acknowledge a military background that she had never discussed with anyone outside official channels. "Yes," she said simply. "Combat engineer, 18th Engineer Brigade. 3 deployments to Syria between 2007 and 2010. The words felt strange after years of silence, like speaking a language she had almost forgotten. The transformation in the Green Berets' demeanor was immediate and complete. The suspicion and concern disappeared, replaced by professional respect and genuine curiosity about the decorated veteran who had been hiding in plain sight as a civilian mechanic. "Steel Cobras," Kim said, recognizing the unit designation that Rachel had mentioned. 18th Engineers were attached to special operations units during some of the heaviest fighting in Syria. "Ma'am, with respect, what the hell are you doing fixing civilian cars in Denver?" It was a fair question, and one that Rachel had been asking herself for 15 years. How did a decorated combat engineer with specialized training in tactical vehicle maintenance end up working anonymously in a civilian garage, using skills earned under enemy fire to solve routine automotive problems? "It's complicated," Rachel replied, understanding that her simple acknowledgement of military service had opened a conversation that would require explanations she had never been prepared to give. The quiet civilian life she had built at Summit Auto was colliding with a classified military past that belonged to a world most people couldn't imagine. But for the first time in 15 years, Rachel was talking to people who could understand that world, who recognized the significance of her decorations, who appreciated the implications of her specialized training. The Green Berets weren't civilian customers or coworkers who would be satisfied with vague explanations. They were professional soldiers who understood classified operations and the reasons why some veterans chose to disappear into civilian anonymity. The revelation moment had passed, but the conversation that would follow would determine whether Rachel's carefully guarded secrets remained protected, or whether her hidden military identity would reshape everything she had built during 15 years of civilian life. Syria, 2007 to 2010. Sergeant Major Kim repeated slowly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood what those dates represented. That was some of the heaviest fighting of the entire conflict. 18th Engineers were right in the middle of it. He paused, studying Rachel's face with new understanding. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what was your final rank?" Rachel hesitated, knowing that her answer would reveal the level of responsibility she had carried during her military service. "Staff Sergeant," she replied. "Squad leader for a tactical vehicle maintenance unit attached to Special Operations Forces." The words felt heavy with memories he had spent 15 years trying to process. Staff Sergeant Lewis whistled softly. "Ma'am, that means you were responsible for keeping special ops vehicles operational in some of the most dangerous territory in Syria. That's not a job they give to people who aren't absolutely the best at what they do." What Lewis didn't say, but all three Green Berets understood, was that vehicle maintenance personnel attached to special operations units were selected for their ability to perform miracles under impossible conditions. When conventional supply lines were cut, when spare parts weren't available, when repairs had to be completed under enemy fire, these were the mechanics who kept critical missions operational. "The Silver Star," Sergeant Jackson said quietly. "That's for gallantry in action against enemy forces." "Ma'am, what happened?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment, organizing memories that she had carefully compartmentalized for 15 years. The incident that had earned her the Silver Star was also the event that had effectively ended her military career, though the full story was classified at levels that prevented most people from understanding what had actually occurred. "October 2009, she began slowly. "My unit was attached to a special operations mission in Anbar province. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in a compound that required specialized vehicle support for extraction. The operation was supposed to be routine: establish a security perimeter, extract the target, withdraw to friendly territory." Kim nodded, familiar with the type of mission Rachel was describing. Special operations frequently required vehicle support for transportation, communications, and emergency extraction when situations deteriorated beyond planned parameters. "The intelligence was incomplete," Rachel continued. "The compound was more heavily defended than expected, and the extraction team came under sustained attack during the operation. 2 of our tactical vehicles were disabled by improvised explosive devices, and a third took damage from small arms fire that compromised its engine systems." Lewis and Jackson exchanged glances, understanding that Rachel was describing a situation where multiple vehicle failures could strand special operations personnel in hostile territory with no backup support available. Standard protocol called for abandoning the disabled vehicles and evacuating personnel using whatever transportation remained operational, Rachel said. But abandoning the vehicles meant leaving behind mission-critical equipment and intelligence materials that couldn't fall into enemy hands. The 3 Green Berets listened with professional attention, recognizing that Rachel was describing the kind of impossible choice that defined combat operations where standard procedures weren't sufficient. "I made a decision that wasn't covered in any manual," Rachel continued. "Instead of abandoning the disabled vehicles, I stayed behind with a small security team to repair them under fire. The idea was to restore enough functionality to extract the vehicles and their sensitive equipment along with the personnel." Kim leaned forward, understanding the implications of what Rachel was describing. "Ma'am, that means you were conducting complex mechanical repairs while under enemy attack, with no backup support, in hostile territory." "For 6 hours," Rachel confirmed. "From 2,200 hours until dawn. The extraction team held a defensive perimeter while I worked on engine systems, transmission repairs, and electrical problems caused by IED damage, all while taking intermittent small arms fire and expecting a coordinated attack at any moment. The technical challenges Rachel was describing were staggering. Combat vehicle repair required precision work with specialized tools, detailed knowledge of complex systems, and the ability to improvise solutions when standard parts weren't available. Performing this work under enemy fire, in darkness, with time running out, it was the kind of impossible mission that defined Special Operations support personnel. "Did you get them running?" Jackson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the presence of Rachel's silver star. "All 3 vehicles," Rachel replied. "Restored full functionality to 2, and enough operational capability to the 3rd to allow self-extraction. The entire team made it back to friendly territory with all personnel, equipment, and intelligence materials intact." The garage was silent as the 3 Green Berets processed what Rachel had told them. The mission she was describing represented the kind of extraordinary performance under extreme pressure that was rare even among elite military personnel. The Silver Star was awarded for gallantry that went far beyond normal duty requirements, and Rachel's actions clearly met that standard. "Ma'am," Kim said quietly, "why did you leave the military? Personnel with your capabilities and combat record usually stay for full careers." It was the question Rachel had been dreading, because answering it required explaining the incident that had made her military service impossible to continue despite her exceptional performance record. The Anbar mission was classified at levels. That prevented official recognition, Rachel explained carefully. The unit I supported, the operation itself, the intelligence objectives, all of it was buried under classification levels that meant it never officially happened. Lewis frowned, beginning to understand the bureaucratic complications that could destroy military careers, even when personnel performed heroically. "You mean you couldn't get proper credit for your actions because acknowledging them would compromise operational security?" "Exactly," Rachel confirmed. "The Silver Star was awarded through classified channels, but my official service record showed routine vehicle maintenance duties with no combat recognition. When promotion boards reviewed my file, they saw a competent mechanic with no distinguished service record." Kim understood the impossible situation Rachel was describing. Military promotion systems relied heavily on documented achievements, but classified operations couldn't be acknowledged in official personnel files. The result was that personnel who performed the most dangerous and important missions often appeared unremarkable to promotion boards, who couldn't access classified information. "It gets worse," Rachel continued. "The psychological evaluation after the Anbar mission recommended limited duty assignments due to stress reactions incompatible with continued special operations support. What they meant was that I had become too valuable and too knowledgeable to risk on future missions, but they couldn't say that officially." The 3 Green Berets recognized the cruel irony of Rachel's situation. Her exceptional performance had made her too important to lose, but acknowledging her importance would compromise operational security. The solution was to reassign her to routine duties that wasted her specialized skills while protecting classified information about her actual capabilities. "So they buried you in regular motor pool assignments," Jackson said, understanding how bureaucratic systems could destroy careers even when personnel performed beyond expectations. "For 2 years, Rachel confirmed. Routine vehicle maintenance. On bases where my combat experience was irrelevant and my specialized skills were unused. I could fix any mechanical problem they gave me, but I wasn't allowed to discuss why I was so good at it or how I had developed those capabilities." The frustration in Rachel's voice was carefully controlled but clearly present. After proving herself under the most extreme conditions imaginable, she had been relegated to routine work that any competent mechanic could perform. Her expertise in tactical vehicle repair, her experience with combat operations, her proven ability to perform miracles under pressure. All of it became irrelevant in garrison assignments, where her classified background couldn't be acknowledged. I left the military in 2012, Rachel concluded. Honorable discharge, full benefits, letters of recommendation that praised my technical competence, while carefully avoiding any mention of why I was so competent. I came to Denver because I wanted to disappear into civilian life where my military background wouldn't matter. Kim studied Rachel's face, understanding now why she had spent 15 years working anonymously in a civilian garage. She wasn't hiding from her military service. She was hiding from a bureaucratic system that had failed to properly recognize or utilize her extraordinary capabilities. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "you've been wasting your talents fixing civilian cars when you could be training the next generation of military vehicle specialists." It was an observation that Rachel had considered many times during her 15 years of civilian life, but she had learned that some doors, once closed by classification and bureaucracy, were difficult to reopen. The conversation that followed Rachel's revelation transformed the entire dynamic in Summit Auto's garage. The three Green Berets were no longer dealing with a civilian contractor of unknown capabilities. They were working with a decorated combat veteran whose specialized expertise had been proven under the most extreme conditions imaginable. But respect and recognition wouldn't solve their immediate problem. 3 tactical vehicles that needed to be mission-ready within 54 hours. "Ma'am," Sergeant Major Kim said, his tone now carrying the professional deference appropriate for addressing a fellow combat veteran, "given your background and experience, what's your assessment of our vehicle's problems?" Rachel felt a familiar surge of professional confidence as she shifted from defensive explanations to technical problem-solving. For the first time in 15 years, she was working with people who understood her true capabilities and appreciated the depth of her expertise. "The altitude compensation failures you're experiencing are more complex than simple programming errors," Rachel explained, moving to the diagnostic computer connected to the lead tactical vehicle. "These trucks were modified for multi-fuel capability and extreme environment operation, but the modifications create interactions between systems that weren't anticipated by the original designers." She pulled up diagnostic screens that displayed engine parameters, fuel system pressures, and ignition timing data that painted a clear picture of cascading system failures. "Look at these pressure readings from your mountain training exercise. When ambient temperature dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude, the fuel density increased beyond the range that your compensation algorithms could handle." Staff Sergeant Lewis studied the data with growing understanding. So the system was trying to compensate for altitude, but it couldn't account for the additional effects of extreme cold on fuel characteristics. "Exactly," Rachel confirmed. "And when the fuel mixture became too rich, it triggered knock sensors that retarded ignition timing, which reduced power output and caused the performance degradation you experienced. The system was trying to protect itself, but it was using the wrong parameters for the actual operating conditions." Sergeant Jackson was taking detailed notes, recognizing that Rachel's analysis went far beyond anything they had received from previous mechanics. "Ma'am, how do we fix it?" Rachel's response demonstrated the depth of expertise that had made her legendary among special operations units. "We need to reprogram the altitude compensation algorithms to include temperature coefficients that account for extreme cold weather operations. But that's just the first step. We also need to modify the knock sensor thresholds and adjust the fuel pressure regulators to handle the expanded range of operating conditions." The technical modifications Rachel was describing required specialized knowledge that went far beyond standard automotive repair. Kim realized that they were receiving solutions that military motor pools had been unable to develop, insights that came from someone who understood both the theoretical engineering and the practical operational requirements of tactical vehicles. "How long will this take?" Kim asked, still focused on their deployment timeline. 6 hours per vehicle if we work systematically, Rachel replied. But I can optimize the process by programming the modifications in parallel while the physical adjustments are being made. Greg, she called to the shop owner, who had been observing the conversation with fascination. I'm going to need exclusive use of the main service bay and access to your diagnostic computer network. Greg nodded immediately, understanding that Summit Auto was about to be involved in work that went far beyond typical civilian automotive repair. Whatever you need, Rachel. This is the most interesting project we've had in years. As Rachel began the complex process of reprogramming tactical vehicle systems, the 3 Green Berets watched with professional appreciation. Her systematic approach, her understanding of military-specific modifications, her ability to identify and solve problems that had stumped other mechanics, all of it confirmed that they were working with someone whose expertise had been earned through experience that most people couldn't imagine. "Ma'am," Lewis observed after watching Rachel work for an hour, "you're making modifications that our motor pool mechanics said were impossible without factory support." Rachel paused in her programming work to explain her approach. Factory support assumes you're working under ideal conditions with unlimited time and resources. Combat operations require solutions that work under field conditions with whatever equipment and materials are available. That means understanding systems well enough to modify them beyond their original design parameters. What Rachel was describing was the fundamental difference between peacetime maintenance and combat engineering. In garrison, mechanical problems were solved by replacing components and following established procedures. In combat, problems were solved by understanding underlying principles well enough to create new solutions when standard approaches weren't sufficient. The first tactical vehicle was ready for testing after 4 hours of intensive work. Rachel had reprogrammed the altitude compensation algorithms, modified fuel system parameters, and adjusted ignition timing to account for the extreme operating conditions that had caused the original failures. But the real test would be weather. Her modifications actually solved the problems under operational conditions. "Start her up," Rachel instructed Kim, who climbed into the driver's seat with obvious anticipation. The engine turned over immediately, settling into a smooth idle that sounded noticeably different from the irregular rhythm that had characterized the vehicle's previous operation. Rachel monitored diagnostic readings as Kim increased engine RPM, checking fuel pressure, ignition timing, and system responses across the full range of operating conditions. "Everything looks good," she announced after several minutes of testing. "But the real proof will be performance under load conditions that simulate your mountain training environment." Kim drove the tactical vehicle out of the garage and onto Summit Auto's parking lot, where he conducted acceleration tests, load simulations, and the kind of operational assessment that would determine whether Rachel's modifications had actually solved their problems. The vehicle's performance was dramatically improved: smooth power delivery, consistent fuel pressure, and none of the hesitation or power loss that had characterized the failures during mountain training. "Outstanding," Kim called out as he returned to the garage. "This truck is performing better than it did before we ever took it to altitude." "Ma'am, whatever you did worked perfectly." The success of Rachel's modifications on the first vehicle provided confidence for tackling the remaining 2 tactical trucks. Her systematic approach meant that the lessons learned from the first repair could be applied more efficiently to the subsequent vehicles, reducing the time required for each successive modification. As she began work on the second tactical vehicle, Rachel felt a professional satisfaction that had been absent from her civilian automotive repair work. She was solving complex problems that required the full extent of her technical expertise, working with people who appreciated her capabilities, and applying skills that had been developed under the most demanding conditions imaginable. "Ma'am," Jackson said as he watched Rachel work on the second vehicle's fuel system modifications, "I have to ask, why haven't you considered returning to military service?" Personnel with your capabilities are exactly what special operations units need. It was a question that Rachel had avoided thinking about for 15 years, but the success of her current work was forcing her to reconsider assumptions about her post-military life. "I assumed that door was closed," she replied honestly. "Classified service records, bureaucratic complications, 15 years of civilian employment. It seemed like too many obstacles to overcome." Kim looked up from the diagnostic computer, where he was monitoring Rachel's programming modifications. "Ma'am, things have changed significantly since 2012. The military has developed new approaches to utilizing personnel with specialized expertise, especially combat veterans with proven capabilities." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Greg Nakamura, who had been making phone calls to accommodate the extended work on the military vehicles. "Rachel," he announced with obvious pride, "I just got off the phone with Colonel Patterson. Remember, your customer with the electrical problems? He heard about the military vehicles and wanted me to tell you that if you ever decide to get back into military work, he has contacts who could help with the transition." The convergence of circumstances, successful technical work, recognition from military professionals, and potential opportunities for returning to the field where her expertise was most valuable, was creating possibilities that Rachel hadn't considered since leaving military service 15 years earlier. But first, she had 2 more tactical vehicles to repair and a deployment deadline to meet. The professional challenges of the present moment took precedence over speculation about future career decisions. Rachel was completing the final system checks on the 3rd tactical vehicle when Sergeant Major Kim's radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission. The voice on the other end carried the kind of controlled tension that indicated a developing crisis requiring immediate response. "Blackwater Base, this is Eagle 6. We have a situation requiring immediate technical support. Multiple vehicle failures during training exercise. Personnel stranded in hostile environment simulation. Request immediate dispatch of qualified maintenance personnel to grid coordinates 39.5891, 105.6423. Kim exchanged glances with Lewis and Jackson before responding. "Eagle 6, this is Blackwater Base. What's the nature of the vehicle failures and current personnel status?" "Blackwater Base, we have 3 tactical vehicles down with engine problems at 11,200 feet elevation. Outside temperature minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 vehicles completely non-operational, 1 with limited mobility. 12 personnel on site with limited cold weather gear. Exercise scenario requires vehicle recovery within 4 hours or mission failure." Rachel looked up from the diagnostic computer, immediately understanding the implications of what she was hearing. Tactical vehicles stranded at high altitude in sub-freezing temperatures created a dangerous situation even during training exercises. If the problems were similar to what she had just solved, standard motor pool mechanics would be unable to restore vehicle functionality under field conditions. "Eagle 6, Kim continued. "What's your assessment of the mechanical problems?" "Blackwater Base. Symptoms are identical to the failures you experienced during last week's mountain training. Power loss, irregular fuel pressure, ignition timing problems. Our field mechanics cannot identify the source of the failures, and standard diagnostic procedures are ineffective under current environmental conditions." Kim looked directly at Rachel, understanding that the crisis developing at 11,200 feet elevation was exactly the kind of situation where her specialized expertise would be essential. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "those are our people up there facing the same problems you just solved for us. But now they're dealing with it in field conditions where improvised solutions are the only option." Rachel felt the familiar surge of professional responsibility that had defined her military career. Personnel in danger, equipment failures that threatened mission success, environmental conditions that pushed standard procedures beyond their limits. These were the challenges that had forged her expertise during 3 combat deployments. How long to reach that location? She asked, already mentally inventorying the tools and equipment that would be necessary for field repairs at high altitude. 45 minutes by helicopter, Lewis replied. But ma'am, this is a military training. Exercise in restricted airspace. Civilian contractors aren't normally authorized for transport to active training sites. Kim made a decision that would reshape the next several hours for everyone involved. Lewis, contact Eagle 6 and inform them that we're bringing a technical specialist with combat engineering experience and tactical vehicle expertise. Authorization will be handled through command channels. As Kim began coordinating helicopter transport and mission authorization, Rachel gathered the specialized tools and equipment that would be necessary for conducting complex mechanical repairs. Under extreme field conditions, the programming devices, diagnostic equipment, and modification tools that had revealed her military background an hour earlier were now essential resources for solving a crisis that threatened the safety of personnel stranded in hostile environmental conditions. "Ma'am," Jackson said as he watched Rachel organize her equipment, "I should warn you that this helicopter flight will be into restricted military airspace during an active training exercise. The conditions on the ground will be similar to combat operations, and the timeline pressure will be significant." Rachel looked up from her equipment preparation with an expression that Kim recognized as professional readiness. "Sergeant, I've conducted mechanical repairs under enemy fire in Syria. High-altitude training exercises are challenging, but they're not combat operations. I can handle whatever conditions we encounter." The helicopter that arrived at Summit Auto 20 minutes later was a military UH-60 Black Hawk configured for cover tactical transport. As Rachel climbed aboard with her equipment, she felt the familiar sensation of returning to military operations after 15 years of civilian life. The helicopter's interior, the professional demeanor of the flight crew, the urgency of the mission, all of it triggered responses that she had learned to control but never fully eliminated during the 45-minute flight to the stranded training exercise. Kim briefed Rachel on the tactical situation they would encounter. 12 special operations personnel conducting cold weather training at high altitude. 3 tactical vehicles with identical failures to what you just repaired. Limited time for diagnosis and repair before training scenario requires extraction. Environmental conditions? Rachel asked, applying the systematic approach to mission planning that had become second nature during her military service. Elevation 11,200 feet, ambient temperature -15 degrees Fahrenheit, wind speed 15 to 25 miles per hour, visibility reduced due to blowing snow. No heated workspaces available, all repairs must be conducted in the open. Rachel nodded, understanding that the environmental conditions would create additional challenges beyond the mechanical problems themselves. Working with specialized diagnostic equipment in sub-freezing temperatures required techniques that most mechanics never encountered. Tools became difficult to handle, computer screens became unreliable, and metal components contracted in ways that affected precision work. Equipment available on site, she continued. Standard field maintenance kit, portable power generation, limited heating capability. Whatever specialized equipment is needed will have to come from what you brought. As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, Rachel could see the 3 stranded tactical vehicles positioned in a defensive formation that indicated this was indeed a realistic training exercise rather than routine maintenance work. Personnel were visible around the vehicles, but their movements suggested the kind of operational urgency that meant the mechanical problems were affecting mission objectives. The helicopter landed in a swirl of snow and wind that immediately demonstrated the challenging conditions they would be working under. Rachel climbed out with her equipment, feeling the shock of -15-degree air and immediately understanding why standard diagnostic procedures would be ineffective under these conditions, Captain Martinez, the officer in charge of the stranded training exercise, approached with obvious relief at seeing technical support arrive. "Ma'am," he said, shouting to be heard over the wind, "we've been trying to solve these engine problems for 3 hours. Our field mechanics are stumped, and we're running out of time before the exercise requires extraction." Rachel surveyed the 3 disabled vehicles, noting immediately that they were identical models to the truck she had just repaired at Summit Auto. The symptoms Martinez described: power loss, irregular fuel pressure, ignition timing problems, matched exactly with the altitude compensation failures she had diagnosed and solved earlier. "Captain," she replied, "I've seen these exact problems before. The failures are caused by interactions between altitude compensation systems and extreme cold temperatures. I know how to fix them, but I'll need to work quickly under these conditions." What Rachel didn't mention was that conducting complex electronic modifications in sub-freezing temperatures with limited power supplies, while personnel waited for transportation that could mean the difference between mission success and failure, was exactly the kind of challenge that had defined her military career. The quiet civilian mechanic who had spent 15 years fixing routine automotive problems was about to demonstrate why she had earned a Silver Star for extraordinary performance under impossible conditions. The specialized expertise that had been buried in civilian anonymity was about to save a military training exercise that had been on the verge of failure. As Rachel began unpacking her diagnostic equipment in the howling wind and blowing snow, she felt the familiar focus that came with life-or-death professional challenges. Some skills once learned under extreme conditions never disappeared. They just waited for the moment when they would be needed again. Working at 11,200 feet elevation in -15-degree temperatures with 20-mile-per-hour winds, Rachel Torres transformed from a civilian mechanic into the combat engineer who had earned a Silver Star in Syria. The environmental conditions that had defeated standard diagnostic procedures became just another operational challenge to overcome through systematic problem-solving and specialized expertise. "Captain Martinez," Rachel called out over the wind, "I need your field mechanics to focus on keeping diagnostic equipment operational while I work on programming modifications. This altitude and temperature combination creates problems that can't be solved using standard procedures." Rachel's approach to the crisis demonstrated the fundamental difference between garrison maintenance and combat engineering. Instead of trying to create ideal working conditions, she adapted her techniques to work effectively under whatever conditions existed. Diagnostic computers that became sluggish in extreme cold were supplemented by manual testing procedures. Tools that became difficult to handle with gloved hands were modified with improvised grips that maintained precision while protecting against frostbite. The first tactical vehicle revealed problems identical to those Rachel had solved at Summit Auto, but the field conditions created additional complications that tested her expertise to its limits. Computer interfaces became unreliable in the extreme cold, requiring her to perform complex programming modifications using manual input methods that took twice as long as normal procedures. "Ma'am," Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, one of the stranded mechanics, observed as he watched Rachel work, "You're using techniques I've never seen before. How are you maintaining diagnostic accuracy when the computer systems are barely functional?" Rachel paused in her programming work to explain her approach while continuing to monitor system parameters through backup display screens. When electronic systems become unreliable, you fall back on mechanical indicators and manual testing procedures. Engine vibration patterns, fuel pressure variations, ignition timing stability. These can all be assessed without computer diagnostics if you know what to look for. What Rachel was demonstrating was the kind of adaptive expertise that could only be developed through experience with equipment failures under extreme conditions. During her military service, she had learned to diagnose and repair tactical vehicles, using whatever methods remained available when primary systems failed. Those skills were proving essential for solving problems under environmental conditions that defeated CONVENTIONAL approaches. Sergeant Major Kim, who had remained in radio contact with the helicopter crew, provided periodic updates on the mission. Timeline: Rachel, we have 90 minutes remaining before the training exercise requires extraction. How are you progressing? First vehicle will be operational within 30 minutes. Rachel replied without pausing in her work. The second vehicle has more complex problems that will require additional time, but I've identified solutions for all the technical issues. The systematic approach that had made Rachel legendary among special operations units was evident in how she organized the repair work. Instead of addressing each vehicle sequentially, she identified common elements that could be repaired in parallel, programming modifications that could be applied to multiple vehicles simultaneously, and diagnostic procedures that maximized efficiency under the challenging environmental conditions. Captain Martinez coordinated his personnel to support Rachel's repair efforts while maintaining the training exercise scenario. Torres, he called out, using the military address that felt natural under operational conditions. What do you need from my people to optimize this repair timeline? I need 3 mechanics focusing on different aspects of the work, Rachel replied, organizing her team with the kind of leadership that Kim recognized as combat-tested experience. Rodriguez on mechanical adjustments, Stevens monitoring diagnostic equipment, Harrison maintaining power supply and tool organization. Everyone else maintains security perimeter and prepares for extraction once vehicles are operational. The parallel workflow that Rachel established allowed her to address multiple technical problems simultaneously while adapting to equipment limitations imposed by extreme environmental conditions. Her programming modifications were applied to all 3 vehicles using interconnected diagnostic systems, while mechanical adjustments were conducted by her improvised team under her direct supervision. As the first tactical vehicle returned to full operational status, the personnel involved in the training exercise began to understand that they were witnessing expertise that went far beyond routine mechanical repair. Rachel's systematic approach, her ability to adapt standard procedures to extreme conditions, and her leadership during the crisis demonstrated capabilities that were rare even among military specialists. Outstanding work, Martinez announced, as the first repaired vehicle demonstrated full performance capability under load testing. Ma'am, whatever modifications you made completely solved the problems that had stumped our motor pool mechanics. The second vehicle presented more complex challenges that required Rachel to improvise solutions using field-expedient methods. When specialized programming tools became unreliable in the extreme cold, she developed workaround procedures that achieved the same results using manual input methods and backup diagnostic systems. This is incredible, Staff Sergeant Stevens observed as he watched Rachel conduct precise electronic modifications using improvised techniques. Ma'am, you're performing complex programming work under conditions where the equipment shouldn't even be functional. Rachel's response revealed the practical experience that distinguished combat veterans from personnel who had only worked under ideal conditions. Equipment operates differently under extreme stress, but it still operates if you understand the underlying systems well enough to adapt your procedures. The key is having backup methods for everything. With 40 minutes remaining before extraction deadline, Rachel completed repairs on the second vehicle and began work on the third tactical truck. The experience gained from the previous repairs allowed her to work more efficiently, applying lessons learned to solve similar problems in less time. The transformation in the stranded personnel was remarkable. What had begun as a training exercise, on the verge of failure due to equipment problems, had become a demonstration of how expertise and leadership could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Rachel's calm competence under extreme pressure provided confidence that mission objectives could still be achieved. Third vehicle operational, Rachel announced as she completed the final programming modifications. All 3 trucks are now configured for reliable performance under extreme altitude and temperature conditions. Captain, your training exercise can continue as planned. The success of the field repair mission created an electric atmosphere among the military personnel who had witnessed Rachel's performance. In less than 3 hours, she had solved mechanical problems that had defeated multiple teams of specialists, working under environmental conditions that made standard procedures impossible. "Ma'am," Kim said as the helicopter prepared for extraction, "what you accomplished here goes beyond exceptional technical work. You demonstrated leadership and problem-solving capabilities under extreme pressure that are exactly what special operations units need." As the helicopter lifted off from the training site, carrying Rachel back to civilian life after her first military operation in 15 years, she reflected on how different the experience had been from her routine work at Summit Auto. The technical challenges had required the full extent of her expertise. The environmental conditions had tested her adaptability, and the mission pressure had demanded the kind of performance that could only come from combat-tested experience. But most significantly, she had worked alongside military professionals who understood and appreciated her capabilities, who recognized the value of her specialized expertise, and who treated her as the decorated combat veteran she had always been rather than the civilian mechanic she had become. The quiet anonymity that had defined her post-military life was ending, replaced by recognition of skills and experience that were too valuable to remain hidden. The question now was whether Rachel would choose to return to the military world where her expertise was most needed, or continue maintaining the civilian identity she had carefully constructed over 15 years of automotive repair work. The helicopter touchdown at Summit Auto marked the end of Rachel's first military operation in 15 years, but it also marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape her understanding of her own value and potential. As she climbed out of the Black Hawk with her equipment, Rachel could see Greg Nakamura and the other mechanics watching from the garage with expressions that mixed pride, amazement, and newfound respect. "Rachel," Greg called out as she approached the building, "I just got off the phone with Colonel Patterson. Word about your work today has already reached military command channels. They're saying you saved the training exercise that was headed for complete mission failure." The speed with which news traveled through military networks didn't surprise Rachel, but the implications were significant. Her carefully maintained civilian anonymity was being replaced by professional recognition that could reshape her career options in ways she hadn't considered since leaving military service 15 years earlier. "Sergeant Major." Kim's radio crackled with an incoming transmission as they entered the garage. "Blackwater Base, this is Eagle 6. Mission status update, all vehicles operational, training exercise continuing as planned. Request immediate debriefing with technical specialist who provided field support." Kim looked at Rachel with an expression that mixed professional respect with genuine appreciation. "Ma'am, that's General Robert Walsh requesting to speak with you directly." Eagle 6 is the call sign for the commanding general of Fort Carson. Generals don't usually request personal debriefings with civilian contractors. The realization that her work had attracted attention at the highest levels of military command created possibilities that Rachel had never seriously considered. During her active duty service, her exceptional performance had been buried under classification levels that prevented recognition. Now her civilian expertise was being evaluated by senior leaders who could authorize opportunities that had been impossible 15 years earlier. "Patch me through," Rachel said, understanding that her response to the general's inquiry could determine whether her military expertise remained a civilian curiosity or became the foundation for a return to military service. Eagle 6, this is Staff Sergeant Torres, Rachel said, unconsciously reverting to her military rank when addressing a general officer. I understand you requested a debriefing on today's technical support mission. Torres, General Walsh's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with exceptional personnel. I've been reviewing reports of your work today. 3 tactical vehicles repaired under extreme field conditions, 12 personnel extracted successfully, training exercise completed on schedule. That's outstanding performance under challenging circumstances. Rachel felt the familiar mixture of professional pride and caution that came with recognition from senior military leadership. Sir, the technical problems were solvable using appropriate diagnostic techniques. The environmental conditions created challenges, but nothing that couldn't be overcome with systematic approach and proper equipment. Sergeant Torres, Walsh continued, I've also been reviewing your service record. 3 deployments, Silver Star, Combat Action Badge, specialized training in tactical vehicle maintenance. What I want to know is why someone with your qualifications and combat record is working civilian automotive repair instead of training the next generation of military vehicle specialists. It was the question that Rachel had been avoiding for 15 years, but hearing it from a general officer who understood military personnel development created an opportunity for honest discussion that hadn't existed during her original military service. Sir, my classified service record created complications for career advancement. Official recognition was limited due to operational security requirements, and bureaucratic systems didn't accommodate personnel whose achievements couldn't be publicly acknowledged. General Walsh was quiet for several moments, processing Rachel's explanation and understanding the institutional failures that had caused the military to lose valuable expertise. Sergeant Torres, things have changed significantly since 2012. We've developed new approaches to utilizing combat veterans with specialized skills, particularly personnel whose expertise was developed through classified operations. Kim, Lewis, and Jackson listened to the conversation with growing understanding that they were witnessing a career transformation that could have significant implications for military vehicle training throughout the service. Sir, Rachel said carefully, what kinds of opportunities are you referring to? I'm prepared to offer you a position as senior instructor at the Army Combat Vehicle Maintenance School at Fort Lee, Virginia. Full rank restoration, immediate. Promotion to Sergeant First Class, command of advanced training programs, and authority to develop curricula based on your combat experience and specialized expertise. The offer represented everything that Rachel had been denied during her original military service: recognition of her capabilities, authority to share her expertise, and the opportunity to influence military vehicle training at the highest levels. But it also meant abandoning the civilian life she had carefully constructed over 15 years. General, she replied, that's an extraordinary opportunity, but I need to understand what it would require. Would I be expected to discuss classified operations? Would my training methods be subject to review by personnel who haven't experienced the scenarios I would be teaching? Walsh's response demonstrated understanding of the concerns that had originally driven Rachel from military service. No requirement to discuss specific classified operations. Your training methods would be evaluated based on results, not theoretical compliance with existing protocols. You would have significant autonomy to develop practical training based on your judgment and experience. Greg Nakamura, who had been listening to the conversation with obvious pride in his employee's achievements, stepped forward. Rachel, he said quietly, this is the opportunity you've been waiting for without knowing it. Your talents have always been wasted on routine automotive repair. This is a chance to influence military training at the level where your expertise can save lives. The 3 Green Berets who had discovered Rachel's hidden identity earlier that day were witnessing the culmination of a process they had inadvertently initiated. Their urgent need for technical expertise had revealed capabilities that were too valuable to remain in civilian obscurity. "Ma'am," Kim said respectfully, "speaking for Special Operations Community, we need instructors who understand how tactical vehicles behave under combat conditions. Your experience and expertise could influence training programs that affect personnel throughout Special Operations Forces." Rachel looked around the garage where she had spent 15 years building a civilian identity, then at the military vehicles that had revealed her true capabilities, then at the personnel who were offering her the opportunity to return to the profession where her skills were most valuable. "General Walsh," she said finally, "I accept the position, but with one condition. I want to maintain connection to practical fieldwork, not just administrative oversight. Real expertise comes from continued engagement with actual problems, not just theoretical instruction." "Condition accepted," Walsh replied immediately. "When can you report for duty?" The transformation from civilian mechanic to senior military instructor was happening faster than Rachel had thought possible, but the opportunity to share expertise that could save lives was too important to delay. "I can report within 2 weeks. Sir, I need time to transition my civilian responsibilities and prepare for return to military service." As the radio conversation concluded, Rachel reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in a single day. This morning, she had been an anonymous civilian mechanic working on routine automotive repairs. Tonight, she was accepting appointment as a senior military instructor with authority to influence tactical vehicle training throughout the armed forces. The silver star and combat action badge that had remained hidden in her toolbox for 15 years were about to become credentials that opened doors to opportunities she had never expected. The specialized expertise that had been buried in civilian anonymity was about to influence military training programs that could affect thousands of personnel. Steve Kowalski, who had worked alongside Rachel for 8 years without knowing her background, approached with obvious amazement. "Rachel, I always knew you were the best mechanic I'd ever worked with, but I never imagined ... This is incredible." The quiet civilian who had spent 15 years avoiding attention was about to become a senior military instructor whose influence would extend throughout the combat vehicle maintenance community. The transformation was complete, but the real work, developing training programs that could save lives, was just beginning. 6 months after accepting her position at the Army Combat Vehicle Maintenance School, Sergeant First Class Rachel Torres stood before the largest audience of her military career. The amphitheater at Fort Lee contained over 300 military vehicle specialists from all service branches, representing the most comprehensive gathering of tactical maintenance expertise in military history. Her training programs had evolved from local experiments to mandatory curriculum for all personnel responsible for combat vehicle operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rachel began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from proven expertise. "Under extreme conditions, 6 months ago, I was fixing civilian cars in Denver, Colorado. Today, I want to share with you the lessons I learned during 15 years of civilian work and 3 combat deployments that can help you keep your vehicles operational when standard procedures aren't sufficient." The audience represented a validation of everything Rachel had worked toward since accepting General Walsh's offer. Combat engineers, special operations mechanics, motor pool specialists, and civilian contractors had gathered to learn techniques that bridged the gap between garrison maintenance and combat field repair. "The most important lesson I can teach you," Rachel continued, "is that exceptional mechanical expertise comes from understanding systems well enough to adapt when conditions exceed design parameters. Textbook procedures work under ideal conditions, but combat operations require solutions that work when nothing is ideal." Master Sergeant David Chun, one of Rachel's former students who had implemented her techniques during recent deployments, provided testimony that captured the real-world impact of her training methods. Ma'am, last month in Afghanistan, our convoy hit an IED that damaged 2 tactical vehicles in ways that should have required complete engine rebuilds. Using techniques from your advanced diagnostics course, we restored both vehicles to operational status using field expedient repairs and improvised modifications. Mission success instead of mission failure. The stories that followed Chen's testimony painted a picture of how Rachel's training methods were influencing military operations worldwide. Vehicle recovery missions that succeeded because mechanics understood adaptation techniques. Combat operations that continued because personnel could improvise solutions under extreme pressure. Lives saved because specialized expertise was available when and where it was needed most. General Patricia Stone, who had flown from Washington specifically to observe Rachel's training programs, addressed the audience during the afternoon session. What Sergeant First Class Torres has accomplished represents a fundamental advancement in how we prepare military personnel for equipment challenges under combat conditions. Her methods aren't just improving maintenance procedures, they're saving lives and completing missions that would otherwise fail. But the most significant validation of Rachel's work came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, a special operations officer who had attended one of her advanced courses, reported on a recent mission that demonstrated the life-saving impact of her training methods. 2 weeks ago, Webb announced to the audience, "My unit conducted a high-risk extraction mission in hostile territory. During the operation, our primary tactical vehicle suffered catastrophic engine damage that should have stranded us behind enemy lines. Using diagnostic techniques and field repair methods learned from Sergeant Torres' training, our vehicle specialist restored partial functionality that allowed successful extraction of all personnel." The amphitheater was silent as Webb continued his testimony. What makes this significant isn't just the successful mission outcome. It's that the techniques required to save those lives aren't taught in standard military curricula. They come from specialized expertise that was developed under combat conditions and refined through 15 years of civilian problem-solving experience. Rachel felt the familiar mixture of professional satisfaction and humility that came with recognition that her work was making a tangible difference in military operations. The specialized knowledge that had been buried in civilian obscurity was now influencing training programs that affected thousands of military personnel worldwide. Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a military psychologist who had studied Rachel's teaching methods, presented research findings that explained why her approach was so effective. Traditional military training focuses on following procedures under normal conditions, Carter explained. Sergeant Torres' methods develop adaptive thinking that functions effectively when normal conditions don't exist. That psychological flexibility is essential for personnel who operate under extreme stress. The research data was remarkable. Personnel who completed Rachel's advanced training showed measurably better performance under pressure, faster problem-solving capabilities during emergencies, and improved leadership effectiveness during crisis situations. The benefits extended beyond vehicle maintenance to influence overall military readiness and operational capability. As the training conference concluded, Rachel reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed since that morning when Green Berets had brought their damaged tactical vehicles to Summit Auto. The civilian mechanic, who had spent 15 years hiding exceptional expertise, was now recognized as one of the military's leading authorities on combat vehicle maintenance and emergency field repair. But the most meaningful recognition came from the personnel who had applied her techniques under real operational conditions. The mechanics who had saved missions by improvising solutions under extreme pressure. The special operations teams who had completed objectives because their vehicles remained operational when standard maintenance would have failed. The combat engineers who had survived dangerous situations by adapting techniques learned through her training programs. Greg Nakamura, who had traveled from Denver to observe Rachel's transformation from civilian employee to military instructor, provided perspective on how much had changed. "Rachel," he said during a private conversation, "when you worked at Summit Auto, I knew you were the best mechanic in Colorado. But I never imagined that your expertise would influence military training programs worldwide." The impact of Rachel's work extended beyond individual success stories to influence military doctrine and training philosophy. Her methods were being incorporated into curricula at military academies, professional development courses for senior leaders, and specialized training programs for elite units. Colonel Sarah Davidson, Rachel's former commanding officer who had flown from retirement in Arizona to attend the conference, provided the most significant recognition of all. "Rachel," she said, "what you've accomplished validates everything I believed about your potential during your original military service. The institutional failures that drove you from active duty have been replaced by recognition of your true value to military readiness." As the conference participants departed to implement Rachel's techniques throughout their respective commands, she understood that her influence would continue expanding through the networks of personnel who carried her methods to units worldwide. The specialized expertise that had been hidden for 15 years was now becoming standard knowledge that could save lives and complete missions under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The Silver Star and Combat Action badge that had remained hidden in her toolbox during years of civilian automotive repair were now displayed prominently in her Fort Lee office, serving as reminders of the combat experience that made her training methods so effective. But more importantly, they represented the foundation of expertise that was now influencing military operations worldwide. Rachel Torres had discovered that some skills are too valuable to remain hidden, that exceptional expertise carries the obligation to share knowledge that can save lives, and that recognition sometimes comes 15 years after the capabilities were first demonstrated. The quiet civilian mechanic had become a military instructor whose influence would extend far beyond her individual career to affect generations of personnel who would face their own impossible mechanical challenges under extreme conditions. Transformation was complete, but the legacy was just beginning. In training facilities worldwide, military personnel were learning techniques that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, between safe return and disaster, between life and death when standard procedures weren't sufficient to overcome impossible challenges. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.